Hey folks, and welcome to Chapter 3 of Biopsychology. This chapter is going to be all about the structures, the anatomy of your nervous system. There's going to be a lot of terminology as we go, including parts of the brain. So be prepared with flashcards, lots of terminology that you may or may not have heard of before, and a little bit of connection to what they do. I'll show you, we're going to hit some of the highlights here. We're going to really focus on parts of the brain that are going to be important later in the semester as we talk about psychological function. So these terms are going to be useful for you here in this class as we go forward and for the quiz in this chapter. But also as psychology majors, these are going to be things that are relevant for us as psychologists. In the first video, I'm going to give you a big picture overview of the nervous system. Then in the next videos, we're going to zoom in on the brain. So let's go. So here's our overview of the nervous system, and you're going to notice that it doesn't just include the brain, right? So we have on one side the central nervous system, and then on the other side we have the peripheral nervous system. And one thing to notice as you sort of learn these differentiations is that everything seems to be organized into twos, at least for now, right? We've got dichotomies. We've got the central and peripheral nervous systems. And then in the central nervous system, we've got two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. We know what those are, right? The brain and the spinal cord. We'll dive into the brain next time. The peripheral nervous system is maybe a little less familiar to most people. It's just what's going on there. And so these differentiations we're going to spend a little bit more time on right now. So as the name implies, the peripheral nervous system is on the periphery or on the outside. Whereas the central nervous system is kind of on the inside or the central part of your nervous system. And so the brain and the spinal cord are in the center, and then the peripheral nervous system are going to be outside of the skull and the spine. There's two divisions of the peripheral nervous system, going in twos. So outside of the spinal cord and outside of the brain, we have a somatic nervous system that interacts with the external environment. What is this, you might ask? Well, it's your skin, right? And your muscles, right? And some interaction with sensory organs too, okay? So we're interacting with the external environment. So we're going to send nerves out to our skin, right? Or from our skin, right? And we're going to send nerves out to our muscles. That's the somatic system. The autonomic nervous system is going to regulate the internal environment. Okay. So what does that mean? What is in an internal environment? Well, we're talking things like glands in your for your hormone regulation. We're talking things like your heart and your stomach, right? Internal organs. Okay. So outside of the brain and the spinal cord, we're going to have nerves going to and from the outside world and to and from the internal world. Cool. So this is all peripheral nervous system because it's peripheral to the central nervous system. And we're going to have this differentiation between the somatic and the autonomic. Now, both of these systems are going to get inputs and outputs. Okay, and there's a technical term for that you're going to see showing up in your textbook and as you move forward in psychology, and that's afferent and efferent. Let's break that down within the somatic system. So the terms afferent and efferent are relative to a reference point. And the reference point typically is the central nervous system, though if you had like a robot or something like that, you could have afferent and efferent signals in a robot too. But in the human body, right, we have afferent and efferent nerves in the somatic system and the autonomic system. These terms sound similar, which makes it kind of annoying to remember. But some heuristics to use is that afferent is going to go to the central nervous system. Okay. So it's going to be accepted. It's going to arrive at or approach the central nervous system. Pick one of those terms to keep in mind. So the afferent nerves are the central nervous system accepts afferent nerves. Okay. The opposite is efferent, which exit, escape, or just embark from the central nervous system. In your somatic system, which interacts with the external world, of course, the sensory nerves are going to be afferent. They're going to come from your skin and be accepted into the central nervous system, whereas your muscular nerves are going to be efferent. They're going to exit the central nervous system and go to your muscles to move your muscles around. Now, your autonomic nervous system has afferent and efferent nerves as well, as nerves go to and from the heart, for example. A little more on the afferent nervous system is because the afferent nervous system does a lot in your body. It regulates your internal environment, right? So it's going to regulate your heart rate, your blood pressure, your bladder tension, that sort of thing. Okay? Afferent and efferent nerves going in and out. But then there's also another differentiation to keep in mind here. So within this autonomic nervous system regulating your internal environment, we're going to have a sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? So there's sympathetic and parasympathetic. And you might have heard these terms in the intro to psych. Okay? Sympathetic is like it's having sympathy on you, right? So you're in a situation, maybe like a fight or flight situation, right? And it's going to stimulate and mobilize energy. Okay, so you need energy, you need your heart rate to go up, your blood pressure go up, that sort of thing. And so that's going to be a sympathetic response. And then there's going to be a parasympathetic response that balances that out so you don't always have increased heart rate, right? So that's going to decrease heart rate, decrease blood pressure, conserve energy. Okay, so this is all part of the autonomic nervous system, where your nervous system is affecting your internal environment and having sympathetic and parasympathetic responses that balance out depending on how much energy we need at any given time. So those are our divisions, and so you should be able to differentiate between between each of these differentiations. So differentiate between the central and peripheral nervous system, differentiate the brain and spinal cord, differentiate within the peripheral nervous system, differentiate between somatic and autonomic, which is external world and internal world. Differentiate between afferent and efferent nerves, right? Being accepted and exiting the central nervous system. And then be able to differentiate sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, activating and conserving. So that's your general overview of the nervous system as a whole. Next thing to talk about in this video is the protections we have for your nervous system. And we're going to walk through a few. We're going to talk about meninges, ventricles, cerebrospinal fluid, and the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so first up we have the meninges, which is essentially a wrapping around your brain. Okay, and there's actually a few layers of this, which is interesting. Here's a picture of an actual brain. Focus on me up here. If you don't want to look on that, focus on this side of the screen. These a few layers. The first layer is called the dura mater, which sounds like durable, which is exactly what it means. It's tough. And then mater sounds like mother, which is exactly what that means too. Literally, dura mater means tough mother. And this is a thick wrapping around the brain. That actually makes it so that when you look at a real brain that hasn't been dissected or cleaned, you can't see any of the grooves in the brain itself. You can just see the this large meninx, the dura mater. Underneath that outer layer of dura mater, we've got two thinner membranes. The one in the middle is called the arachnoid membrane. It gets that name like arachnophobia, like spiders, because it's got like a web-like consistency going around the brain itself. And there's fluid underneath that web. Finally, a very small layer laying right up against the brain itself. There's a very thin layer called the pia mater, which is another mother, but in this case it's the pious mother, pia, pious. And that's the final layer of protection. The meninges wrap around the brain so that nothing can get to the outside without having to go through a few layers of protection to keep it safe. Now, you may be aware of a term called meningitis, a disease called meningitis. Itis means inflammation. So if you get an infection that causes inflammation of your meninges, that's meningitis. And it's very dangerous, right? Because the meninges that are supposed to be protecting your brain, there's inflammation in or around those structures, which can cause brain damage. Your book's got a nice figure of the meninges showing where they sit relative to the scalp. If you want to study that sort of thing, the main point here is that we've got the three layers that are going to be underneath the scalp, between the scalp and the brain. That fluid we mentioned is called the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF sometimes. The cerebrospinal fluid is going to be protective as well, in addition to the meninges, by providing essentially support and cushion for the brain. It's liquid, really inside the brain and in the spinal cord to provide a cushion. It has some other functions as well, but here we're talking about that protective function that it has. You'll find CSF in a few places. Sometimes you'll see it outside the brain in that subarachnoid space. You'll also see it inside the vein in structures called ventricles. There's big fluid-filled areas inside the brain. Those are called ventricles. And then you'll see it up and down the spinal cord in the central canal. A couple interesting things about CSF that you might be aware of is that in developing babies, sometimes they'll get a condition called hydrocephalus. Hydro means water, and cephalus means head, so like water head, right? Where you get a buildup of this cerebrospinal fluid, and the skull hasn't quite taken shape, so the skull can get distended in certain places. That's not the brain changing shape; it's the fluid, cerebrospinal fluid building up. The other thing you might be aware of with cerebrospinal fluid is a lumbar puncture, sometimes referred to as a spinal tap. So if I want to actually get at the chemical makeup of the central nervous system, I don't have to go to the brain itself. I can go into the spinal cord, or a doctor can, and pull out the cerebrospinal fluid from that central canal. And so then they can test for things like meningitis. As I mentioned on the previous page, there are ventricles inside the brain with cerebrospinal fluid inside to provide that cushion. You can see those ventricles here to just give you a sense of where they are and how large they are. Actually, a decent amount of your head space is full of fluid like this. Your book names and labels the locations of each of these. If you're in my class, I'm not going to test you on the names of these. It's not going to be relevant for psychology in particular. So just to give you a sense of where they are, but just know that I won't be testing you on those locations. Your final protection for your nervous system is called the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is the name for the phenomenon where the blood vessels, your veins and your arteries that we find in your brain have tightly packed walls. And this prevents large molecules from moving in and out of your arteries and your veins in the central nervous system. Now, the function of this blood-brain barrier is to protect harmful chemicals from exiting and entering into your brain. Okay? It's going to, there's a number of things that could cause brain damage that don't, right? So we eat a number of foods that could cause brain damage if they could get into the brain itself, into the neurons of your brain, but they can't pass through the walls of your blood vessels, and so they simply get recycled back through in your circulatory system without making it into your brain. That's the blood-brain barrier at work. The other function of the blood-brain barrier is that it helps to maintain this really finely tuned chemical environment that we'll talk about in the next chapter. Okay? And so we need a very finely tuned chemical environment in order to have action potentials where the neurons fire. And the blood-brain barrier helps to make sure that that chemical environment isn't going to be affected by as many outside forces. Okay. One chemical note, clinical note from this phenomenon of this blood-brain barrier is it does mean that if I'm trying to create drugs that are going to influence psychology, I'm going to need to have drugs that can pass the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so for example, in Parkinson's disease, a common treatment is to try to get dopamine into your system. We'll talk about why soon. But dopamine is too large to get through your blood vessels. It gets stopped at the blood-brain barrier, partly because we don't want dopamine coming out of the brain, right? And so we can't just take a dopamine pill. And so you have to take a different version of dopamine called L-DOPA that can make it through the blood-brain barrier. So there's a bunch of tricks around this. Okay, and that's it. That's your layers of protection for the brain and your overview of the nervous system. In the next videos, we'll cover the brain itself.